Good evening, everyone. My name is Ana Lúcia Araújo. Welcome to the Slaveryarchive Book Club. This is an initiative led by me, Vanessa Holden, and Alex Hill, who are my co-hosts, and also our other co-host, then we are four, Jessica Johnson, who is at Hopkins, Alex Hill is at Columbia, and Vanessa Holden is at the University of Kentucky. Then let me just start by introducing our presenter today. Then today we are discussing this beautiful book, Relative Races, Genealogies of Interracial Kinship in 19th Century America by Brigitte Fielder, and she published this book in 2020 with Duke University Press. Then let me just introduce Brigitte Fielder. She is an associate professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She's the author of the book that I just presented, Relative Races, Genealogies of Intermarriage, Kinship in 19th Century America by Duke University Press 2020. And she's also the co-editor of Against a Sharp White Background, Infrastructures of African American Print, published with University of Wisconsin Press in 2019. Her work has been published in journals such as American Quarterly, Legacy, a journal of American women writers, American Literary History, and TSWL, Tulsa Studies in Women's Literature. Also, her work appeared in several edited collections. Brigitte, she is currently working on a book about racialized human-animal relationships in the long 19th century, which shows then how childhood becomes a key site for often simultaneous humanization and racialization. Other work in progress by Brigitte includes then a project on early Black futures, which considers then early Black employments of old technology as a form of proto-Afrofuturism, and in which attention to Black childhood becomes a project of deliberate and radically hopeful futuring. Then welcome everyone who are here today, and also welcome Brigitte, who is here to present her book. And now I pass the floor to her.
Hello, thank you so very much for having me. I've been very much enjoying watching this book series and in these conversations, and I'm honored to be here among all of the authors who have been featured already. So thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen, and I hope you can see this. Does that look all right to everyone? Yep. Okay, great.
Yes.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to open by talking just a little bit about the cover of my book. If you look at the cover of this book, you might recognize these images, probably more so of William Craft than Ellen. In Ellen and William Craft's disguise and escape from slavery, we see the extent to which race operates not only in racialized bodies, but in the relationships between them. Because Ellen, who here I think looks like a very kind of tokenized white lady in 19th century portraiture, because she could pass for white, but her husband couldn't, her relationship to him needed to be refigured in order to affect their passing together into freedom. So Ellen's whiteness depends upon her distance from any assumptions of sexual kinship with William. The racializing effects of this relationship are such that she can be white only by disguising herself as William's enslaver, and she passed as a white man with him as an enslaved person with her. Ellen and William are pictured here along with some of their children. Now, while Ellen might be easily read as a white woman in this portrait, viewed in these relations to her more obviously, visibly Black family members, she becomes more legible as a mixed race Black woman. Although Blackness is not always visible, these images of the Craft family show us one way in which race is relative, not simply conveyed upon Ellen Craft in a top-down genealogy passed from parents to children, but constructed via her kinship relations with her husband and with their children, in relation to whom her own race might be read. My book is about how race is formed in relation, and much of this has to do with questions of how race is reproduced as a constructed form of reproduction. Children, both imagined and real, appear throughout this discussion. And I begin with reading Kate Chopin's 1893 story, Desiree's Baby, which shows what I call a kind of backward genealogy of racial transfer, in which Desiree, a woman of unknown racial genealogy, is re-racialized by virtue not of her own parentage. We don't actually learn anything about Desiree's genealogy over the course of the story, but because her baby becomes visibly Black. Children are essential to racial formation in the United States, and we can see this in the rule of hypodescent, usually called the one-drop rule, that determines how that any amount of Black ancestry has historically rendered somebody Black. And the social rule of Black racialization is related to the laws of matrilineally inherited slavery, which in an odd 1662 law of the Virginia colony, enslaved children were determined to follow the condition of their mothers, regardless of their father's race or their free status. Just as a mother's enslaved status alone might determine her child's, only one parent's identification as Black seems sufficient to racialize children as such. My project is interested in figuring out how race works by reading various kinds of theorizations of race in US literature and history. My project is also invested in realizing the theoretical in the literary. As scholars from Barbara Christian to Derek Spires have shown, literary forms also do theoretical work. And so Toni Morrison's novels and dramatic works have influenced my understandings of the literary as theoretical, and some of these figure in my discussions of 19th century texts that I discuss here. So I read her 2011 play, Desdemona, her 2004 libretto, Margaret Garner, an opera in 2 acts, and her 2008 novel, A Mercy, not only for her representations of race, but for her deft theoretical work. Reading race and relation allows us to see the different scales at which race is made, simultaneously racializing at the level of body, home, and nation, and creating a kind of circular teleology of racial reproduction and reconstruction. And my book is organized so as to treat race through these expanding scales of body, family, and nation under the headings romance, reproduction, and residency. And these scales also indicate race's ever-expanding stakes. So I'll walk through these scales just briefly in my chapters for anyone who hasn't read yet. And I'll start with romance, or what I call sexual kinship. I begin with a kind of urtext for white racist anxieties about interracial kinship in the 19th century in this image of Othello and Desdemona, which appears in Edward William Clay's kind of racist depiction of a mixed race family. And here I discuss how white women are positioned as especially, and here's a close-up of that image, susceptible to receiving race. Just as Othello's blackface makeup in 19th century productions of Othello rubbed off onto Desdemona, making her too begrimed and Black. And in this chapter, this first chapter, I read some minstrel iterations of Othello in which Desdemona is already begrimed and Black as mine own face at the beginning of this, and thinking about how this odd re-racialization of Desdemona speaks to those white racist anxieties about how race works, transferred from Black men who seemingly have it to white women who seemingly receive it. My second chapter talks about William G. Allen's 1853 personal narrative, The American Prejudice Against Color, which describes events surrounding his engagement to the white daughter of abolitionists, Mary King. In the midst of the couple's harassment and their forced separation, Allen shows how Mary King gets read as a mixed race heroine by some of their friends by virtue of their family's fugitivity. Their friend writes, "I can almost call you Eliza," referring to Eliza Harris of Stowe's novel. And Eliza flees specifically to protect her child, because not Eliza, but her child has been sold away. And so figuring Mary King, a white woman, as a mixed race heroine shows us something about how racialization and genre might be thought together. And in this section, I'm very much interested in how genre becomes a force also for reading race. So the kind of narrative in which readers read Mary King as either a damsel in need of white protection or a fugitive, who is under duress, show us different ways that she is read both generically and racially. The second section on reproduction focuses on how racial production and reproduction are forces of racialization and re-racialization. Here I read racial reproduction via both inherited racialization and also different kinds of re-racialization. So this is an image from the Bantam cover of Mark Twain's 1893 novel, Pudd'nhead Wilson, showing Roxy, a woman who switches her baby for the baby of her enslaver, effectively re-racializing both children by virtue of her relationship to them. I take up Roxy here not only as a mammy figure, but also as a mother, showing the intertwined forces of Black motherhood and mammyhood in this text, but taking up Black motherhood particularly as a force for racial reproduction. And we can see this in many ways in the figure of the mammy that becomes so prominent in 19th century depictions of Black women, and I'd say probably into the 20th century as well. A kind of depiction that effectively displaces Black children and erases Black motherhood, even while Black motherhood is always implied in this arrangement of labor in which Black women would nurse the children of their enslavers, presumably because they had weaned children of their own, displaced their own children in order to do that forced labor. And I read Black motherhood also in Frances Harper's 1892 novel, Isla Leroy, where we see a mixed race Black woman's deliberate racial reproduction of Blackness. And this is present from Harper's dedication of the novel to her own daughter throughout her depiction of Black motherhood throughout. And despite her heroine's ability to visually pass as white, Harper shows how it's Iola's relationship to her Black woman family members and to her own future potential children who may or may not be able to pass, who ultimately racialize her beyond a bodily scale. So regardless of what this woman looks like, the way she is racially identified has to do with who she calls family. This photograph of Sojourner Truth sitting with a portrait of her grandson on her lap shows us something of these intergenerational workings of race, as she racializes not only her children, but multiple generations of people in this image. And so this is something that skips over her own child to show her grandchild here, showing us the kind of multiplicity of generational racialization at work here. We also see how Black women have thwarted racial reproduction, as with the example of Margaret Garner, who infamously killed a 2-year-old daughter and attempted to kill her other children in order to prevent them from being returned to slavery. And so I read Garner as a figure who shows us how interracial kinship relations come to bear upon connections between childhood and racial futures that are not only reproduced, but sometimes not reproduced. And my third section takes us from the familial scale outward to the national, resonating these dual meanings of domestic and domesticity, and considering how racialization comes to bear upon both of these simultaneously. This is the back of an image of a statue of Mary Jemison, which is located at her gravesite. Jemison is a woman who was born white and adopted by a Seneca family in 1755, and thereby becomes a Seneca girl and a Seneca woman. Jemison's kinship with her family, her marriages, and especially her relations to her children become reasons that she gives for refusing to be redeemed into a white settler community. We see her memorialized here carrying a child on her back, a Seneca child who is under great threat from settler colonialist violence, as is Jemison herself during Sullivan's campaign. Here's an image of Jemison's cabin, which is now at Letchworth State Park. And here is the land at Gardeau, Jemison's homeland before she's removed to Buffalo Creek River Reservation. And this relationship to space shows us through Jemison's racialization, and I think the racialization of Native people more broadly, cannot be separated from the work that racialization's attempts to disconnect Native people from Native land and sovereignty. And finally, in literatures of national family race drama, I show how different scales in which race is made simultaneously working at body, home, and nation, creating race's circular teleology of reproduction and reconstruction. So coming full circle at the end of this book, we can see how racialization of interracial sexuality and the production of mixed race children are at the heart of race's national stakes. And these are just some examples showing laws, state laws, prohibiting interracial marriage in 1835 and 1867. And those national stakes intertwined with the bodily are visible from early national contexts of Thomas Jefferson's Children Born of Sally Hemings to Reconstruction era fictionalizations of mixed race children who come to reproduce the nation in books like William Wells Brown's Clotel and Lydia Marie Child's Romance of the Republic. The coda of my book brings us to a discussion of white women's failures of interracial kinship, showing how the racializations of white women that I discuss throughout this project are more often otherwise. So my final example is an event during the 2018 Women's March in which white feminist protesters in Harlem put a pink pussy hat on the head of this statue by Allison Sarr, Swing Low, a statue of Harriet Tubman, showing how these failures of sisterhood, the kind of failures of sisterhood that we also see at the end of Toni Morrison's novel, A Mercy, show us how white womanhood goes on to reproduce itself, most often by aligning with white supremacist ideals of racialization and reproduction. And so I'll leave just with a little tiny bit from the end of this project that speaks to this, kind of turn away from what I'm discussing through most of this book. When the queer possibilities of racial reconstruction come into view, we can see more radical possibilities for white women in particular, possibilities that have the potential to decenter white supremacy by halting its reproduction. This doesn't necessitate halting the reproduction of white presenting bodies, of course, but offering these bodies different racial genealogical possibilities. White genealogies do not necessarily tend towards whiteness in their racial reproduction. Other racial teleologies are and have always been possible. This book was in many ways a product of my trying to figure out how the various texts that I discussed throughout are illustrating race and racialization, showing us how race is made, how race is often talked about in these very biological, essentializing ways, even while we know that race is constructed, but that the ways people write about race, the way people depict race, don't always tend towards those kinds of essentialist notions of racial reproduction. And so I very much wanted to think more heavily about race's possibilities in this text, and ultimately determining that those possibilities don't necessarily tend towards the kinds of essentialist race making that we were accustomed to, and also not necessarily the kinds of heteronormative ideas about race making. And so even where I'm talking about race making in heterosexual couples throughout this book, the race flows, choosing some parents' genealogies rather than others, is not always a heteronormative project. And that too became interesting to me. And so I'll end there and look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you so much, Brigitte. Let me just see, you can, okay, you are still sharing. And let's see if you have any questions, any comments. You can just raise your hand by clicking at the bottom of the screen on reactions. And here we go. This is always the moment when people are shy, but I am sure that they will start jumping. Who doesn't want to start? I don't think we have anything coming from YouTube at this point, but go ahead, please, if you have a question. Okay, I will start with a very simple question to Brigitte, just for us to situate better your work and how this work emerged. If you can let us know a little bit about how did you start this this project, and of course that the focus of the book is the 19th century, but I ask myself if there are any kinds of if there is any possible extensions that could be made to the 18th century, and if there is any kind of rupture in the 19th century that is more visible. One of the things I see, because of course this is not my field, is the 19th century. One of the wealthy elements of this period is that we have much more visual images, and a number of elements that you are describing, of course, they come from literary texts, but they also come from photography and from engravings and other kinds of visual images. Then I ask myself if there are any possible bridges with the previous century, and if there is any kind of ruptures or continuities that we see, and also if you would like to tell us a little bit about how this project emerged.
Hey, thanks very much. I came to this project in a kind of odd way, which I think is maybe how I come to most projects, trying to figure something out rather than making a decision about what I was writing about. And some of the earliest, work that I wrote here was my work on both Mary Jemison and the early adaptations of Othello. And so in Mary Jemison's narrative, which begins, well, her narrative is published in the 1830s, but the story that takes place of this real life woman begins in the 18th century, is with the captivity narrative. And one of the things that interested me was the impetus to read this as a captivity narrative when the vast majority of this did not have to do with her captivity, but had to do with her later life, as an adoptee into a family who, is recognized as a full part of that family. that genre, I think, becomes really interesting and important for other parts of the project, like William Allen's narrative, for example. People, and very similar to how some people had difficulty reading Mary Jemison's narrative as a captivity narrative, even though she does not seek redemption or want redemption. And this is mostly, in many ways, a narrative that's overwhelmingly puts her in opposition to white settler colonialists. People wanted to read Mary King as if it were a captivity narrative in this old genre, in order to make an argument for her redemption. And I think those generic, thank you, Jerry. Those generic similarities and tendencies, I think, are really interesting holdovers from earlier moments. But also I see in the 19th century United States, some interesting changes made. So readings of Othello, for example, were in no way interested in what Shakespeare may or may not have thought about race, but they very much enacted white racist anxieties about interracial mixture in their renderings of that play, whether they were doing that play straight and omitting certain lines, or whether but still putting Othello in blackface, though mitigating it in some ways, rendering him in what was called tawny face to make him not so black, even though he was played by a white man anyway, or whether they were rendering this on the minstrel stage, making this whole thing a kind of farce, putting it in the form of the British burlesque, but with a very important racialized changes to what that did. And so I see in both of these examples, a very particular kind of racial agenda being employed that is, at least in the text that I discuss, intertwined with the reproduction of a white nation in very many ways, and intertwined with very specific, thank you, Terry, very specific kinds of notions about racialization that allowed for a system of race-based slavery that also very much did not make sense in a logical way, right? And so only Black people are enslavable. Well, what if you can't tell if people are Black or not? Well, anybody's enslavable if their mother was enslaved. And anti-slavery advocates kind of work out the problems of this in a lot of different ways. We can see evidence of this, I think, in a lot of kind of real world things today too, right? Like why anybody in the royal family would care how Black Meghan Markle's baby is, and what that has to do with them, is part of this same narrative of racialization and relation. Why this child who you just saw with curly red hair gets read differently when he's with me than when he's read with my white husband, have to do with ideas of racial literacy and how his race is read not only within his own body, but also next to the bodies of those around him. And so, I see these as, even though this is a 19th century project, I see the 19th century as really kind of pouring into a lot of spaces in ways that it still very much get perpetuated in the 21st.
Thank you. And of course, this is going to be a temptation to extend your 19th century study to the present. I am sure that you are going to have questions on that. We have now Jessica.
Hello. Thank you for a really fascinating text. I have two questions. One is about your framing of kinfulness as opposed to kinlessness, and I just would love to hear you just talk about that and expand on that and think with that with us a little bit. And the other question is is in a whole other direction, which is I feel like there's so much here, and I'm hoping that we get into this in other kinds of ways about white womanhood and its constitution, which I find really, really interesting, and engage critically in a way that we don't normally necessarily engage critically. And I'm wondering about your framing there, your choice to do that, like, what was that work like? What is it, what is white womanhood, for you as a project? I think you clarify that a lot in how you're, in like, especially the summing up, the last chapter, and the kind of sutured kinships that that white women engage in, with the example of the pink hats and all of that. Like, there was so much richness there. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, and also about where white manhood might situate itself also in relation to this, knowing that that is not necessarily your focus. I'm just curious if you had ways to riff on that, and if you could share some of that with us.
Thank you so much. Yes, so I think some of these questions are actually intertwined in some ways. And so, my reading of kinfulness rather than kinlessness looks a little bit differently at this kind of same phenomenon of what happens to Black families under enslavement. And, understanding the ways that familial ties might be rendered under that system historically, is one side of this same coin. But the other side of this coin, and so I don't think these are actually in opposition to one another, I guess, in some ways. But the other side of kinlessness is a way in which I'm interested in not only slavery, but racialization more broadly and its effects upon families, which in a lot of the texts that I discussed, Frances Harper's Iola Leroy is a good example. Slavery doesn't actually render this woman kinless. She has family members. She is separated from them. But one of her problems is that she's separated from some of her family members as a result of slavery. The other problem is that she's related to some enslavers. And so when we have this form of violent reproduction, which in this case of this book isn't, Iola Leroy's origins aren't about the rape of enslaved women, but we can think about this alongside the rape of enslaved women as well. Problems in biological kinship not matching up with familial recognition. And in that recognition, I am less interested in who white men care about than I am in who Black women care about. And so we can see how people who are related to enslavers and people who are related to enslaved people, Iola has too many kin. Some of these people are people who she wants to seek out, and she has white relations that are not. And I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about and understanding this phenomenon, that the way hypodescent works, the way the system of slavery that would enslave children based on their mother's enslaved status works, is to deny some kinship relations and prioritize others. And so in this kinfulness, I'm trying to think about the fuller recognition of kinship relations that go beyond just biological relatedness, and that might also extend outside of biological relatedness, but that also speak to various kinds of non-heteronormative family making that would allow for different kinds of kin making, right, beyond the biological. when it comes to white men, you know, one of the things I realized kind of over the course of graduate school, as someone who has done a lot of white male studies, as you know, most people educated in the United States have, is that focusing on white men in some of these stories, focusing on fatherhood, focusing on you know, kind of patrilineal, isn't going to answer the questions that I'm asking. Focusing on Thomas Jefferson's relationship to, you know, and the people, his enslaved children, isn't going to tell us about, you know, their racial, you know, makeup necessarily. And so I've been interested in putting white men aside in certain ways. There's a question in the chat that's kind of related to this, Iola's decision regarding love and family. She's, you know, a white looking woman. She meets a guy named Dr. Gresham, who's fine. He's, you know, an abolitionist, and he wants to marry her. But he has this racist mother, and he's interested in Iola passing in order to be with him. And his idea of this is that, well, you know, you're just as white as any white lady. Why can't you come and make my mother your mother? And, you know, and we can, you know, live in the North. And he's not Southern, he's Northern abolitionist white man. And Iola's like, look, do you understand that our babies could look any which way? And are you prepared for that conversation when we have a child who comes up looking Black? And he's very confused about how babies happen and how race is made. And he doesn't understand any of this in a way that I think, you know, speaks to a certain kind of, you know, ignorance about Blackness and how it travels, that, you know, Black people just don't have in that context. And I think don't have in a lot of other contexts in the 21st century either. And so he's taken aback and he's like, oh, I hadn't thought about Black babies. And she's like, yeah, I don't want to go live with your mother. I have my own mother and I need to go find her. And I'm not interested in this. And so the kind of narratives that, you know, you know, I've written a lot about the mixed race heroine in mixed race heroine fiction elsewhere. And I think it's true that, you know, readings of the white men in these kinds of stories in many ways misses the point. They're of a kind of genre in which they, you know, are never terribly interesting, but follow a trope of basically being unable and unwilling to love and care for Black women. And so the Black women who don't die in these things make different choices for their families. And so, you know, that's kind of how I came to be interested in this. Reading Iola as a woman who, you know, also, you know, grows up thinking herself to be a white woman and, you know, making this series of choices about which family she's going to acknowledge and not, you know, it is part of this narrative of white womanhood, I think, in many ways, because, you know, one thing about the failures of white feminism that are really, really stark in the 19th century, when we have this whole breakdown over suffrage and the passing of the 15th Amendment, for example, is that that failure is a complete non-necessity. There are any number of moments in which that lend themselves to a kind of multiracial sorority that could happen. There is nothing inherent about white womanhood that makes this, you know, that naturally tends toward failing at that kind of solidarity, even while that's a historical fact of, you know, the majority of white women aligning with white supremacy, you know, in various moments throughout U.S. history. We can see that happening, but naturalizing it, I think, is tied up in, you know, the racialization of white women in certain ways. And so so that's one of the reasons that I'm interested in reading these white women characters who are a bit unusual, because they show us the exceptions, you know, that prove that non-necessity of reproductions of white supremacist versions of white womanhood over the years. And that's not just about the reproduction of white children, but it's also about the reproduction of relations at various scales, both familial and national. And so these kind of odd examples of white womanhood that does otherwise, I think it's important to kind of think about them in these 19th century moments, because this is a long period in which arguments about racism kind of more generally tends in popular conversation to naturalize that racism, or to limit that racism to forms of white liberal anti-slavery efforts or something like that. And so reading these kind of radically different ideas of white women who are in interracial family relations that thereby affect whiteness, shows us the relationship of whiteness to that kind of preservation that we see at the heart of white supremacy, and white supremacist anxieties about family, why we have laws about interracial marriage in this country, why we still continue to have people who are concerned about white genocide as a really throwback phrase that I have seen written in an email in the 21st century, is because the idea of whiteness as segregated familially, bodily, nationally, are all kind of wrapped up in one another. And then genocide takes us to this, like the entire humanity, white people are going to end. It's kind of a bizarre extremist concern. But it comes also down to, the production of mixed race babies, that a pretty basic thing. That if we make mixed race babies, that like white people are going to die off and disappear from the earth. And being really, really committed to having anxiety about that is really interesting to me, in part because we have so many other models throughout, U.S. history that give us, other ideas about what white women can do and be. And white women are, and I think it, really important to this project, because they are the people who are held responsible for reproducing the nation, even though we know that that they are not solely responsible for producing babies. And so so there's an interesting kind of misogyny that's also kind of tied up in this. The policing of white women's bodies is really, really important to a white supremacist project. And when we see white women who do other stuff, then we kind of understand why policing white women's bodies becomes really important for that project.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Brigitte. Do we have other questions? I am not seeing any hands, but you can jump in. We have some comments in the chat. Then Brigitte, she can read the comments, but I read out loud for those who are on YouTube. B. Francis Clark is saying, out of curiosity, what is your assessment of Yola's ultimate decision regarding love and family? Then somewhat this was already mentioned, but perhaps you can revisit the issue. And B. Francis Clark also, there is also the theme element in Yola that race ultimately trumps love. That's an overly simplified statement, of course, but what is your take on that? Seems to me to be somewhat near the heart of the matter, at least in that book. Hope you understood. If not, you read.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, that's interesting. I guess the idea that race trumps love is true of white characters like Dr. Gresham. I mean, I think, yeah, he is interested in marrying a white woman more than he is interested in this particular woman who is in front of him, who is not understanding herself to be white. regardless of whatever she looks like. I think for Iola, that's kind of a deal breaker. And I don't think that her relationship to this guy is necessarily anything that I would call love. I think she understands the conditional nature of whatever his proposal is, and she's not interested in that. I think her relationship to her family members, shows us, I think, a kind of prioritization of biological family. In terms of the people who she seeks out are all biologically related to her, but I think that the question of whether her Black family is going to be able to embrace mixed race Black people is a different question than whether these white Northerners are going to embrace mixed race Black people. And the answer is that one of these groups has always embraced mixed race Black people, and the other has overwhelmingly not, historically. And so, I think her kind of reading of that situation is a deft one, and it's not. I think she is smart enough to kind of understand that whatever this person feels for her and proposes for her, that it is insufficient and not what she wants. And when she does find love, because this is a whole heteronormative romance, at the end she marries this very nice Black guy, who is also mixed race Black person. That this ability to embrace a shared racial identification that's going to allow for a relationship, to relationships with all of the various people in her family and their larger community, is something that is important to her and a deal breaker for her romantic relationships, and I think essentially also her future childbearing. So I think that's some of what the choices that get laid out for her there. And and the novel doesn't end specifically with a prioritization of mixed race Black people. Her brother, who's also light-skinned and can pass for white, marries a dark-skinned Black woman, and that seems to be a really important, I think, important and often overlooked point at the end of Harper's novel.
Thank you. Do we have more questions or comments? And I know that some of you did not necessarily read the book, but if you are curious about any of the other dimensions of the book, I have a question from Martha. Welcome, Martha Jones. Nice to see you.
Thanks very much, Ana Lucia and everybody. Thank you so much for this book and the chance to talk with you about it. My question maybe is partly methodological, but I think it's also maybe historical. Part of what's so important for me about this book is the way in which you sort of defy any kind of narrow genre-like thinking for exploring your questions. And I was making a list for myself of all the kinds of materials, artifacts, sources, as I would think of them, that you've worked with. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit, like, I guess, relatively about the sources. And I'm loath to ask you to sort of create a hierarchy among and between them, but I wonder sort of what you would say to those of us who admire your approach about how to think relatively about working with the novel and the lithograph and then the photograph and more. And so it's not a very well-formed question, but just to open up some space for you to talk about how you've come to think about genre and how you might help us, who admire your approach, but also are less familiar with moving through so many different kinds of materials.
Thanks so much for that question. I really appreciate that. I mean, I think one kind of odd answer to this question is that when I was an undergraduate a very long time ago, I dropped my English major. And so I don't have a bachelor's degree in English, and moved about a bit, reading other things before coming to graduate studies in English literature. And so I think my relationship to genre, and especially the literary, has always been a bit unusual in terms of how I think folks are trained to study and read literature, to make certain kinds of prioritizations of genre. And in many ways, this book is a mix of lots of genres even within the same chapter. And I don't make a lot of distinctions between them in terms of hierarchization, but I'm trained in graduate studies, you know, in a kind of American studies approach to all of this, which is to recognize that these things are operating within the same realm. And so whether I'm reading a novel or whether I'm looking at an image, these things aren't necessarily unrelated. You know, speaking to the visual, I think there was no way to write about certain kinds of things without thinking of the visual, at least in some ways, because a lot of the texts that I'm writing about do have to do with visual representations of race, and what that does. So if I think of something like, you know, Clay's images of racial mixture, and how, you know, this play figures in the background of, literally in the background of that image, referencing the play that people maybe have seen, or at least have an idea about, maybe not even seen. And so there's, you know, also the extra textual, I think, that's floating around here as well. You know, I think that that methodology is actually a kind of advantage, you know, my willingness, I guess, to not prioritize novels and poems and things, because it has allowed me to have archival experiences that have really enriched this project. And so as I'm reading about Othello, I'm reading about how Othello is performed in the United States. I have acting editions, you know, of these minstrel plays, but we don't necessarily have, you know, nobody's putting these on anymore, thank goodness. And so I've never seen one performed, and have to think differently to understand, you know, what the relationship between that ephemeral event and this script that I'm looking at might be. And so somewhere in there is, I think, you know, visual representations of Othello and Desdemona that circulated in various places, both in terms of like political cartoons and, you know, actually serious renditions of the couple meant to advertise, you know, this play. You know, thinking about, you know, the different genres as well has also allowed me to think about historical fiction, which is a favorite genre of mine, and one that I think folks in literature have difficulty placing. I cannot tell you how often I write about, in my chapter on these 19th century minstrel plays of Othello, I write about Toni Morrison's play Desdemona, her 21st century play Desdemona, and that the essay version of that chapter was rejected so many times, and people hated the fact that I talked about Toni Morrison next to these 19th century minstrel plays and wanted me to take this out. But this is all very much about Desdemona, and in my kind of deliberateness about saying that these things go together, even though they're not within the same periodization, I think is another part of my methodology, you know, not quite falling within what I imagine people learn to do in literary studies. And so while I do think I have fairly historicist readings of what's going on here, thinking beyond these historical moments, like, what happens when Toni Morrison writes a libretto about Margaret Garner? There's a lot of things about Margaret Garner. They don't, they're not all contemporaneous with one another, but they contribute to how we think about her in a public imagination and what's going on in many ways, theorizations of what and how happened, in this event. I think thinking those things next to one another, which may require a kind of interdisciplinarity or conversations across different kinds of textuality. Reading libretto is different from reading up a novel, as it turns out. How to write about that, how to write about the relationships between these things has allowed me to think conceptually about this and to kind of prioritize these concepts in many ways. Which I think is also importantly allowed me to include the writings of writing about actual living people in this alongside fiction, as both are, I think, doing very similar literary work in many ways. And I'm very interested in genre as as a project of repetition and revision, and as people play with different genres for rethinking different literary tropes and concepts, and how that happens, sometimes in a different form than in the previous form of that genre. And so I am very interested in the kinds of, I guess, the kinds of work that goes into making a genre and remaking a genre and remaking a genre. And I think that's some of what's going on in, in this array of texts. People are, articulating an idea of race and re-articulating an idea of race and re-articulating an idea of race. And they do that in different media, and they do that in different moments, and they do that often in ways that throw back to the 19th century. Sometimes putting those things next to each other in a kind of collage, I think allows us to see patterns that wouldn't necessarily be visible if I were to just look at things in a particular generic set. And so I think those patterns and being able to rearrange texts to see those patterns was important for me, trying to figure out what's going on with race during this span of time, and what do people think was going on with race in this span of time, even if they're writing in later periods, that I wouldn't necessarily have seen if I just read like novels or just read poetry.
Thank you so much. I know you have a question from Vanessa, but she's there. Are you there, Vanessa?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, thank you. Then go ahead.
Sorry about that. My unruly sausage dog got in the way, but he's fine now. So I have a question. You talk about playing with time and chronology and the ways we think of inheritance, or the ways that people are relative to one another. And I'm interested in thinking about the ways that not just the assumption of racial mixture can blacken children, but the sorts of assumptions that it's possible to lighten or create a proximity to whiteness. And I'm asking this actually from a historical memory viewpoint. I had the opportunity to work with some of the descendants of people that I study in the 19th century, and found myself in a family cemetery where there was a section for white descendants of a particular great-great-grandmother and Black descendants. Now, none of these people were white; they were all Black, but they had their own section of the cemetery, and said great-grandmother was actually buried with her Black children and not the white children that she had. Now, this is a distinction that her kids got in the Black community. They also received property from their white father, which was something that distinguished them from their Black siblings. But the ways that even the terms white and Black are playing out, you know, there's a sense of both. It wasn't necessarily a positive thing to be considered one of the white members. This isn't necessarily sort of a status, you know, that is looked upon kindly by the family, but it exists still, and the whole story around it and the great grandmother's relationship with both Black and white men is still there, and it's right there in the cemetery, chiseled out in stone. And the whole memory and family story around the relationship continues to be important and factor into people's property considerations in the present. Similarly, anecdotally, you know, I talk to descendant communities that don't want to acknowledge at all any white ancestry because of how exactly that white ancestry came to be. And so when looking at this from, you know, not just a, you know, how people are related, not just in their own time, but how they're kind of relating across generations, not in an inheritance sense, but in a how are we remembering the ways these past families were constituted and how do those constitutions come to impact our present. Yeah, I was wondering if you could kind of take us to the time piece of what you're looking at, so we can kind of think through just exploding these categories a little bit more. Why not, right? That's what Slavery Archive Book Club is for. Just blow them up. Yeah.
Yeah, the question of historical memory is really, really interesting to me. I think in part because you know, historical memory is somehow inconsistent in many ways when it comes to race in the United States. And so, you know, how we think about, you know, how we think about interracial family in the United States is about bizarre twists of historical memory, in which the fact that this was always part of United States history is something that people continually forget for reasons that I don't quite understand. And so, you know, you can think about someone like Thomas Jefferson, and you know, and I'm thinking of, you know, like Annette Gordon-Reed's massive work on Jefferson and Hemmings and the Hemmings family. But like, you know, one of the books that I read in the 1850s is William Morris Brown's Clotel, which critiques, which critiques Thomas Jefferson's, you know, children with, you know, it's the Clotel or the president's daughter, right? The idea that this president had enslaved children. When did people stop knowing that? This was like an open secret. Everyone knew about Jefferson's Black enslaved children. And at some point that became a thing that needed to be revealed. And I'm not really sure when that happens historically. You know, Eston Hemmings Jefferson is buried in Madison, Wisconsin, in the cemetery here. And that family has all these like Jefferson Wells family names in the cemetery. I went there after reading Hemingson's Monticello, and it's all there. And they passed as white, and I want to say it's his children fought in the Union Army as white men. But his brother Madison Hemmings, you know, is not, and it's you know, which branch, you know, what branch of the Jefferson family becomes the branch that then like reveals this thing that people knew. You know, there's you know, interesting, you know, during Jefferson's lifetime, there's interesting like political cartoons about this. It's not like this was an actual secret. And so how historical memory around race works is really bizarre. And I'm interested in time in so much as it's not linear, but kind of circular in a lot of ways. And so we've come full circle somehow to knowing that Thomas Jefferson had these enslaved children with Sally Hemings, but that's not new. And it's important to know that that's not news in the 21st century. But that this is information that had been available, and I think also like locally available to people who lived around there, and also within families. And so with someone like Eston Hemings Jefferson, like I wonder, like when and how do they pass, and what kind of generational story does that entail? Who in their family knows about this? I'm not sure. And, you know, and when this becomes, you know, a history that isn't told. And so, you know, I'm, you know, this is, you know, not unlike a lot of African American history, which is available to us in many ways, and which, you know, doesn't necessarily follow this linear path of being told in the way that one thinks that it could be told. Or it's, you know, told by certain people, and those, you know, chronologies of telling Black history don't necessarily cross with, you know, chronologies of telling mainstream US history, even though those historical threads are obviously intertwined. You know, the you know, the circular and disjointed workings of time are interesting here to me, because they align in many ways with the circular and disjointed lineages of race. Blackness could skip a generation, right? If Viola were to marry Dr. Gresham, they might get on fine, and she might pass as white to his white Northern mother, and like maybe they have a baby, and that baby can pass. But what happens, you know, like, but maybe in the next generation they can't, like, you know, what if that, you know, what if that next generation is like Desiree, and all of a sudden this baby looks visibly Black? You know, the you know, the anxiety about race's visuality, the fact that race doesn't always follow patterns of like clear lightening and darkening, or whatever, that mixed race people in mixed race families can look any kind of ways, lots of different ways, lots of different, you know, skin colors and hair textures, and, you know, and whatnot, is, you know, kind of evidence of, you know, race's unpredictability in those visual terms, and thinking about the illogic of race making, the illogic of racism too, helps to make some of this make sense. And so if one's looking for, you know, a kind of clear thread about how, you know, how people understand race over time, it doesn't work, it doesn't pan out, because people aren't working on logical, historically building threads. They're making all kinds of moves that don't quite fit with what we know. Like when Josiah Nott in the like 1840s makes an argument that, you know, mixed race women are going to be sterile, and it's going to be the end of humans. Now, people have to know that mixed race women are not sterile because they are enslavable, and the US economy is dependent upon the fact that enslaved women's reproduction is going to garner wealth for their enslavers, regardless of who those daddies are. And yet one can make in a major, you know, scientific venue this argument, you know, about hybridity, and how this is going to lead to the end of humankind or something, because these people aren't going to be able to reproduce, and this is why, you know, race mixing is a problem. And so it's those inconsistencies, the many histories, the many linearities, the many you know, versions of this that kind of come together and tell us these interesting stories about race and chronology and history and relativity, that I think is really interesting. And so once, with this project, I had originally organized it stupidly for no real reason, chronologically, trying to think that the first texts that I talked about would be in the first chapter, which I think are the Mary Jemison work, and that I would work my way up to tell some kind of historical story about how people thought about race. But that story isn't really available. And once I realized that this wasn't a chronological history of how people think about race to tell, then I could arrange this in a way that made sense. I think, despite, or maybe because of the fact that it's kind of admits to its circularity, and that I could have begun at the very end in some ways, but chose not to foreground, one of the most racist texts that I've ever read, and kind of didn't do that. But that there wasn't a clear path through this to me was a kind of revelation as someone who was thinking that that this had to fit together historically in some kind of alignment.
Thank you, Brigitte. One element that I would like to comment in what you are saying is there are two levels here. This issue of course, for us historians, this the issue of time, how these perceptions in terms of race they change, and the issue of memory that Vanessa brought. In the case of the iconic case of Jefferson, of course, that I am not a specialist of Jefferson and all the details regarding his family, but it seems to me that in among his Black descendants, among those who claim to be Black descendants of Jefferson, this memory of his Black family remain alive. Of course, that those wanted to, who were forced to pass as whites, they had to somewhat forget that those roots connecting them to slavery. But the Clotel case and all these other caricatures and contemporary commentary that existed about him having enslaved children, it stopped in then it was during his lifetime and also during the period of his slavery. But I think that when we move towards the 20th century and segregation, end of the slavery and so on, this memory is erased in a way that is not it's not naturally done. There were people who were the bearers of the memory of Jefferson, and they deliberately then took actions to hide this the existence of these descendants, and it happened elsewhere as well. For example, people who were slave owners who until the end of the 19th century still appeared, for example, Colston in Bristol still appeared as slave owners in the public space, and at some point they were depicted as something else. In the case of Jefferson, there is correspondence among those Black descendants and people who were descendants of enslaved people who would contact the foundation, and who even had objects, artifacts they inherited from their families, and they were not heard at that time because the white family didn't want at all, or the white historians indeed, who kept the foundation, didn't want to highlight this dimension. Another thing that I think that your work is very interesting also for historians who are working on other spaces, especially in Latin America, where this issue of race seems to be more fluid, and where we have this that you are describing, that if people they have that mixed race will lead to the end of the white race. In the case of Latin America, the idea that racial mixture indeed will end the existence of Black people in these countries. There were attempts of doing that. Of course, it didn't work here, it didn't work there, but then there are these two opposites that I think that are very interesting to think about based on what you bring in this book. Now, let's see, we have still space for one more question. Then I don't know if we have any hands here, but I see that we have B. Francis Clark, who brought some elements here in the chat that I read for you. And Brigitte, she can do it as well. He's saying both when this happened and very precisely why lies at the heart of this whole conversation. One could argue that racism has a very predictable irrationality, but indeed his question is up there. He's saying, where do you see the genre most accurately represented and contested today? Any particular works that come to mind for you? Okay, not sure if you can, but if you want to jump and possibly comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I'm hesitant to, I guess, speak to any particular genre. In that I see I see this happening in lots of places in contemporary moment that are you know, in conversation with, you know, some the kinds of things that I talk about. And so you know, this is why I end up writing at the very end of this in a kind of last minute decision about, you know, a piece of hate mail that some people at my university got about about white genocide. That's a genre in which I think this appears, that people are still having this very 19th century conversation about the end of white people. And I put this next to a text from the 1830s that's, you know, this very racist, you know, panic about interracial mixture, because I think they're of the same type in many ways. I could see this, you know, in all of the conversation about Meghan Markle's baby and how Black that baby was going to be, you know, which was a kind of transatlantic conversation, but a conversation that's familiar to people in U.S. contexts, you know, especially people familiar with, you know, mixed race Black people and, you know, the kinds of the particular, you know, kinds of anti-Blackness that are directed at people whose reproduction of Blackness is maybe questionable. You know, I can see this, you know, in lots of different places, and you know, and you know, and of course, I think some of Morrison's, you know, recent-ish work, you know, speaks that way too. But I think it's, you know, not necessarily in these kinds of texts that look back at the past, but, you know, also in the way people talk about race in the present, where we need kind of more complex way of talking about what race is and isn't and does and doesn't do, that you know, can allow for some of these more complex histories of race and racialization to you know, to kind of come into play.
Thank you, Brigitte. I don't see any other questions, but I would like to ask you one last comment in terms of your work, because you mentioned then, and in the book you that you focused a lot on this, the issue of white women, and then that white women were really the bearers of this idea of they were the important players in deciding then who would be Black or white. And I ask this question regarding the contemporary, the present day issues. Then over the last 2 years, we saw a number of interesting cases. And I ask, does it happen in your work to see then if you would like to comment, to see white women moving then attempting to pass as Black women, which is the 19th century, it can be very tricky. But we saw over the last 2 years here in the US, and you are not necessarily, and you are seeing similar issues even elsewhere as well, white women then who have been posing as Black women and who were somewhat, their story was somewhat exposed on the internet. Then we had first the two iconic cases, Rachel Dolezal and then Jessica Krug, aka Jessica La Bamboleira. And I ask myself whether or not we have any kind of, is there any dialogue between this kind of, because it was not a white man who were doing that. Perhaps there are cases, but what is interesting in this particular cases, and this is just two of them, it's really white women who have been the major players in this idea of today passing as attempting to pass as Black women. I ask if there are any bridges, any possible then connections with what you do in terms of the 19th century.
Thanks so much for that question. And I've written about failures of white feminism in other contexts, but I've only written about mixed race white women, mixed race Black, white women, imposters of mixed race Black women, very, very briefly in an introduction to a special issue that I wrote with Katie Phillips on minstrelsy and racist appropriation. And I think one of the things that's interesting to me here is that these instances of white women masquerading as, light-skinned Black women is, these ideas of race and racialization as inhering in individual bodies rather than in the relations between them. And so, the idea that to become a Black person, that you just need to put something on, and you just need to embody a thing, is really interesting to me, because as a mixed race Black woman, like my position here has to do with the fact that I'm related to Black people in kinship. And what these examples of white women masquerading seem to draw out is an absolute failure of solidarity with Black women who they attempt to embody or represent or masquerade as rather than relate to. And the truth of the matter is that one could be a white woman in solidarity with Black women or with other women of color and accomplish things. But that this wasn't the choice that these people made. And it speaks to I think a really interesting idea of what race is as an individualized thing. That is an idea of race and racialization that prevents them from being able to do the work, because this is relational work, right? Like if one wanted to, if we're contending that these people do this because they want to be in community with Black people, recognizing that that's not about your bodily presentation, I think is maybe the first step. Or that that's not the only thing that's going on here that would put you into this. And it's not just, I think, biological family, but I think also larger scales of community and relation, you know, that we might think about that. And so these are interesting examples because they play on such old racist tropes, right? The treachery of mixed race Black people is like a whole thing. The idea that Blackness can be put on and performed is a whole thing. You know, white women's failures of interracial solidarity with women of color is its own whole thing. And all of those kind of come together in this example in an interesting way. Well, meanwhile, there are and always have been lots of other ways that one could be in racial relation with other people. And so I've been very interested in my academic work in, you know, just kind of as a recently tenured person, and like thinking about, you know, what would it mean if we recognized our racial embodied positions with when we thought about our relationships to other people, when we took that into account when we're thinking about other relations of power that we have with one another, like when we're advising, for example, or when in mentoring relationships. What would recognizing the complex relations of both institutionalized and racialized and gendered power, you know, that are kind of going on, it would take a lot more work to do that, but I think it would give us some better ideas about how to think about those relations and how they all shake out. And it seems to me that like these instances of passing are a very simple surface level idea of not only what race is, but what like racial relations must be. Just if you think at the very heart of like, how do you even pull this off? Obviously, this is going to be, you know, that these people are kind of found out is the most unsurprising part of it, right? You know, in an age of, you know, when your life can be kind of documented, and that life is not just what you look like, but also your relations to other people. So yeah, so this has been an interesting part of this. I had thought very briefly about whether or not to write about someone like Rachel Dolezal in this book, and decided against it because the more I was interested in writing about you know, how ideas of white womanhood get employed, the less I was interested in writing about actual white women, and became more invested in African American women's writing. And so, you know, my turn here too has been in many ways towards early Black feminist, you know, renderings of, you know, mothers and children and relationships. And so I kind of left that aside, but the one place that I have put any kind of pen to this phenomenon, which is larger than that one figure, is about racist appropriation in minstrelsy, because that too is part of this longer, very 19th century kind of tradition.
Thank you so much, Brigitte. And then we are going to conclude right now. This is the book that we read today, Relative Races and Genealogies of Interracial Kinship in 19th Century America, published by Duke University Press, 2020. And that if you didn't get the book, go ahead, and now you had then an idea of what the book is about, and I encourage you to read. And I would like to invite you for our next book club session that is going to be on July 21st, Wednesday, 5 p.m. And I am reading because I don't want to make any mistake. This will be the book then by Vanessa Holden, who is here with us. Her book, Surviving Southampton African-American Women and Resistance in Nat Turner's Community. And this is a book published by University of Illinois Press, 2021. Then the book is out right now. Then go ahead, get the book, and join us in 2 weeks from now to discuss, to celebrate the book by Vanessa Holden. And meanwhile, I would like to say thanks to Brigitte for her wonderful book. And thank you for being with us during the summer, then discussing with us. Also would like to thank Jessica for being here, who is our co-host. Also say thank you to Vanessa, and also say thank you to Alex. We have been working very hard to keep the Slavery Archive book alive, and I hope to see you all in 2 weeks from now. Then thank you so much for joining us.